tonight we're going to hear from David East of the Firebase team here at Google, who's going to talk about the current state of forms in Angular 2. And this is really important for us because we're designing something brand new, and it's something nobody has ever tried before. And we need your input on this. So have a look at what we're doing and tell us how this is going to work out for you, and maybe even try it yourself. Before we get going, I want to talk about a couple cool things that are going on in the world of Angular. One of the cool things since we last met is that we have a release candidate 0 for Angular 1.4, and lots of good things have gone into this. Tons of bug fixes, over 35 features. We keep working on speed. Even though Angular 2 is our primary path for amazing speed, we can still do better speed in Angular 1, and we'll continue to work on that. And there are new versions of many of the facilities, things like the new router, there's a new IE10 facility, animations. We think this is going to be a fairly easy upgrade for most folks. There's very few breaking changes. You can find details on GitHub, and you'll get a link to the slide deck later if you want to get that link. After we're done with 1.4, we're going to start planning for 1.5. A lot of the focus will be on how do we migrate to Angular 2 and making that easy from 1.5. And as always, we'll take your input on what else should go into it. We did go out and do a conference in Utah, and there are 35 videos from this. If you didn't manage to catch it on the live stream, these are all out on YouTube. I took a couple of my favorites as excerpts, but you have links to all 35 of the talks. At least watch these 3 if you're going to do nothing else. There are some upcoming shows. Right here in our own neighborhood in San Francisco, we have Angular U that's coming up on the 22nd through 25th of June. We would love to see you there. Myself, Igor, Mishko, and some of the rest of us will be out there talking about where we are in Angular 1 and Angular 2, and we'll be much further along by then. It should be a lot of fun. Later this fall, if you don't happen to be on this continent, we're doing one over in London. We would also like you to even fly over for that as well. That's happening in October, the 21st through the 22nd. You can sign up for both of these. We would love you to come to both. You can find the link to the slide deck right here. And with that, I'm going to welcome David East, going to talk to us about forms in Angular 2.
All right. Can everyone hear me good? Okay, you can throw something at me, preferably soft. If you can't hear me, just let me know. All right, so as Brad said, we're going to do a talk on Angular 2 forms. And also, as he said, my name is David East. I work full-time on the Firebase team here at Google, and I work part-time on Angular, where I help out with the new documentation that's going out. If you've seen the Angular I/O site, help work on that. And we're going to have lots of cool stuff to help you understand Angular 2 and have a lot of cool references. So I'm going to working on that. And before I get going, I want to throw up the disclaimer. Angular 2 is a work in progress. It's still currently in alpha. So I usually hear a question is, I know Angular 2 is in alpha today, but can I start building my app on it? I would not do that. Don't build your Angular 2 apps right now for production. So with that out of the way, here is the outline for tonight. A lot of you may have been at the last meetup or seen the video, or have seen a lot of Angular 2 talks from ngConf. But just to make sure that we're all on the same page tonight, we're going to do a little Angular 2 crash course. And then once we're on the same page, we'll start talking about forms. And we're going to go over why forms are hard, and that's going to set the stage for what Angular 2 forms tries to achieve. And then just to make it all seem real, we're going to be doing some live coding at the end. So this is the obligatory Angular 2 crash course. So Angular 2 itself, the framework is written in TypeScript. But just because Angular 2 is written in TypeScript, it does not mean that your app needs to be written in TypeScript. You can write your app in ES5 or ES6 because Angular 2 actually, because TypeScript compiles down to either ES5 or ES6. So you can essentially you can write it in any of those languages or versions of the language. And Angular 2 is all about components. Components are the mainstay. So essentially, components are ways for us to break down our UI into small, reusable pieces, so we're not doing the same thing over and over again. And the way we represent components is through the elements. So right here, we have a component called to-do-app. And when Angular 2 sees this element, it's going to execute the code above, which is the component definition. So this block of code right here, we call it the component definition, has two main parts. And I'm going to go through each one of these one by one. So the first part are the annotations. And the annotations are how we customize components. So the first one is the component annotation. And this customizes this class. It tells Angular that this class belongs to the component. And then it also tells Angular that this class has a selector, or the component has a selector of to-do app. So as you saw in the previous one, we have to-do app down here. I get that by stating to-do app up there. And then the second annotation we see is the view annotation. The view annotation tells Angular where our template for our component lives. So it'll do a request, and we'll know that our template is at todos.html. So annotations allow us to customize our components. But and we also can do annotations in ES5. So just because the @ is TypeScript specific, it doesn't mean that you're chained to @script. In this case, in ES5, we don't have classes. We have a constructor function. And then below, we're on the constructor function, we have an annotations property. And we give that an array. And each element of the array is an annotation. And it's very similar to what you saw before. We have a new component with the selector to-do app, and the new view, which gives us the URL out to the view, which is, as you can see, similar to what we have on both slides. So that allows us to customize this component, but we need to have a backing. When we create our templates, we're going to be calling functions, we're going to be accessing properties. And all of those sit on our controller. So this is the actual class. In this case, I'm creating a to-dos array, which is an array of string, which is a type for TypeScript. It's not something that you need to do even if you're writing TypeScript. And then inside my constructor, I'm just initializing it to 2 initial string elements. And then I have a function that allows me to push onto my to-dos array. So it's something very simple. And even in ES5, it's still very simple. I have my constructor function, I initialize my to-dos, and on the prototype, I add my add to-do function. So in both languages, or both versions of the language, it's still pretty easy. So this is the backing of my component's view. And for the view, it has its own syntax, which is new. And there's 3 main things we're going to talk about. There's lots of cool stuff with template syntax, but if you understand the 3 things we'll go over today, then you're going to be just fine, and we'll be able to go pretty far with that. So the 3 pieces we're going to talk about are right here in just 3 elements. The first one is, you see the #. We have # text box. And essentially what we're doing is we're creating a local variable that's assigned to this text box. So I actually have a reference to this input element. And so the second one down, we are actually registering a click event. And then we're calling the add-to-do method from the click event. And we know that add-to-do method exists because it's on our component's controller. And I'm passing that add-to-do method a string value, which is the value of the local variable text box that I created before. And this is the actual value that the user has typed in. And at the bottom, I'm binding the inner text of the div to the text box's value. And in Angular 1, we bound to attributes of HTML elements. In Angular 2, we can bind to the actual DOM property. So in this case, I can say, if I was to grab this element by saying document.getElementById, from that DOM element, I could call inner text and set the inner text. I'm essentially doing the same thing here. Now, you would probably not do this in a real-life example. You would just use the curly braces for string interpolation. This is just me getting clever to show you that inner text is not an attribute on a div. It's the actual property. So this is it all back together in one component. We have our annotations, and we have our controller. So those are the 2 main parts of an Angular component. So that's the crash course. You are all now Angular 2 experts, so you know just as much as me. So now we're going to talk about forms. And forms are great because they're essentially one of our few outlets to the user. All we're pretty much doing on the web is we're trying to find ways to get input from the user, and forms are the main mechanism for doing this. But the not so great thing is that we actually can't trust the user. And even if the user is not doing malicious things to our form, they're seldomly actually going to fill it out properly. If we didn't actually validate that the email was valid, you would probably never have any real emails. Or if you didn't validate that the phone number format was valid, you would probably just get random string values. So since we can't trust the user, this makes our forms hard. We have to put in a lot of complex logic to make sure we're actually getting back what we want. And then if we have complex logic, that has to be tested. And forms, they are not static. They happen over time. So there's multiple pieces to a form a user has to fill out, and this puts your form in different states. And we have to be able to update the user, or update ourselves really, just to know what the state of the form is as the user fills it out. So with complex logic, one control can be dependent on the logic of another. So essentially, if I update one control, it can update something else on the form. And if I reverse something somewhere, it can cause me to have to reset everything again. And the user doesn't actually have to answer your form in the manner that you wanted them to. You may want them to go top-bottom on their form, but they may go from the bottom to the middle, back to one other spot, and then right back up to the top. And they answer one thing that should have been answered before another, and then your form puts them in these different and kind of crazy invalid error states. And so that frustrates the user, it frustrates your form, and they may never actually make it through. So we have a lot of testing to make sure that this works. Except testing is not that great with forms, because we have to compile the template and then run an end-to-end test, which breaks those of you who like BDD and TDD, which says my tests must be isolated from the DOM and must be fast. Well, with end-to-end tests, they don't do that. They're completely isolated to the DOM, and it takes a while to run, whether you're using Phantom.js or a Chrome launcher or whatever. And when we deal with changes over time, we're not actually sure what's happening. So we could be waiting on a response back from a server to tell a user that the username is taken or not taken. And we could be evaluating input telling the user that they have this many characters left on the form, and that might open or close something else as I'm typing. And this all triggers changes on dependent control. So we need like solid ways to figure out what's changing and how we can adapt to those changes. So these are the problems that Angular 2 Forms aims to achieve, or aims to solve. So Angular 2 Forms is actually a module, external module of Angular. So if you're familiar with the way you include the router in Angular 1, where we just include the extra script file and then we add it as a dependency, Angular 2 Forms works in a similar way. It's not integrated into the core of Angular, so you can include it and you can use it and be happy, or if you don't want to use it and not be happy, that's fine too. So it's not required, but it's really useful. And there's three ways we can create a form. There's imperative-driven, which will be the only way we talk about tonight, but there's also data-driven, which I just want to pass in data and generate out a form, and then there's template-driven, which is similar to the way we do forms nowadays in Angular 1, where we put ng-model on that, and that implicitly creates our forms. We're going to do more explicit form creation through the first version, which is imperative-driven. So Angular 2 Forms, we're going to look and we're going to see how we accomplish solving these three goals of complex logic, easy testing, and simplify evaluating changes. So to solve the complex logic, we have two concepts called controls and validators. A control is the smallest piece of Angular forms. It essentially represents just a single input. So that could be a text box, essentially anything that pulls back the value from a user. And the API for it is pretty simple. And all I have to do is create a new control. So var name control equals a new control, and I just provide an initial value of my name. And if I want to get the name back from it, all I have to do is call .value. And then just like in Angular 1, there's similar state properties I can call upon to figure out what's going on. So I can see whether it's valid, whether it's dirty, whether it hasn't been changed and it's pristine, and I can get all of the errors in the array or get the length and count up what's going on with the form. So that's just one control, but it's seldomly that you're just doing one control. Our controls are usually dependent on each other, and we want to know the overall state of the form. So we use a control group for that, which is a collection of controls. And the API for that is also pretty easy. In this case, we create a variable called group. We create a new control group, and then we give it an object literal, where the key value for the object literal is the name of the control, and so in this case, full name, and then the value is the actual control. So we say new control, provide it my full name, and then I give it an optional validator. I can say validators.required. And that essentially, when we call .valid, that decides whether it is valid. And so we'll go into how we do validators in just a minute. And the API for this is nearly identical to the API for one single control. So after we create a group, we can check to see whether it's valid, whether it's dirty, pristine, and get all the errors. So in this case, when I have a group, it'll check the overall state of my form. Is everything valid that should be valid? I call one place for it to be valid. I don't have to check 5 different places to see if everything is valid. And if you thought the syntax for that was too clunky, well, there is the form builder API. We create the form builder up top, and then I can call builder.group. And from that function, I pass an object literal in. Just like before, the key is the name of the control, and the value is an array. And the array represents a control. So how we said new control, initial value, validator, it's just array, initial value, validator. And speaking of validators, all validators is they're functions that encapsulate your form's custom logic. So we'll take a look at how we make our own validator. They only require a few things. The first requirement is that you have to pass in a control, or assume that you're going to be operating with a control. The first one, and right here we have C, and then it expects a type of control. And this is TypeScript. It's the only difference between this code example being an ES5 or ES6 and TypeScript is we would just strip the control type. And we just assume in ES5 or ES6 that we're talking to a control. So this validator is called the not blank validator. And it doesn't do anything really all that fancy. It just checks to make sure what we're inputting is not equal to the empty string. And so if something's not equal to the empty string, we're going to return null. And that says, lets the validator know that everything was valid. But if someone puts the empty string in, we're going to check for that. And then we're going to return an object literal with the invalid errors. So in this case, we're saying the not blank error is true. So that's pretty much all you have to do for validators. And when we create this function, this allows us to essentially encapsulate all of our complex form logic inside of just this little function. And then down here, when I create a control, I say var control equals a new control, give it an initial value of hello, pass that validator function in. And now if I were to say control.valid, in this case, it would be valid because it's not equal to the empty string. But if I updated its value to the empty string, it would then become invalid. So this is everything we've covered up to this point, just in one big component. It's not even really that big. So the first thing we're doing at the top is we're importing all the usual suspects from Angular 2. And this is using ES6 module syntax. This is anything that's native to Angular or TypeScript. This is just the way that JavaScript is evolving. So we're importing these things from Angular 2, and then we're importing things from Angular Forms because it's an external module. Since it's not required, we need to import it on its own. Then we're using our component template, or our component annotation, our view annotation, and then we're creating our component controller, which has a property of form. And so right here in the constructor, you're going to see a little bit of dependency injection. In this case, we have a parameter called builder, and then this takes a type of form builder. And this essentially tells Angular, when I get into the constructor, I need to resolve builder to a new instance of form builder. So this is how dependency injection works in Angular with components. It's all done through the constructor. So since I have a new instance of the form builder, I'll create my form right here. And so now that I have my component built, I'm going to actually be able to run through and do some testing. So testing is pretty easy. I don't have to actually do, I don't have a template yet. We haven't even gone over syntax, and I'm running tests because my tests are completely independent of the DOM. So since my form builder took in a component, since my component took in a form builder, I passed that builder into my component. And then just using console.assert, which is available in all consoles, so it's nothing fancy to Angular, I can say app.form, which is the property on the component's controller, and I can ask whether it's a valid form. And the initial state is invalid, because if we take a look at it, we have 2 validators on the form, and the initial state of them are set to the empty string, so we know it's going to be invalid. So this assertion will pass because we say, let's assert that the form's initial state is invalid. But if we were to insert that it was valid, this assertion would fail. So in just a couple lines of code, I've written a unit test for my form that's completely independent of the DOM, so it's fast and it's isolated. And so now that we've gone over how we build our forms, we have to know how we get them onto the view itself. And so we have a specific template syntax to do that. So we created a form group, so we can add this form group to the page through the control group property binding. So we're binding to the property here, and we're creating a form, and that form is the property of our controller. So we've stated that our form goes onto the view, and then now we can bind the individual controls. So just as we use the control group property binding, we're going to use the control property binding here. And we'll tap into form.controls.fullname. And what this will allow, and this will essentially bind the full name property, or full name control, into our text box. But if you think it's a little clunky to keep diving or keep tapping into other properties, we can use what is known as the control decorator. And the control decorator, this isn't an attribute, it's a decorator. So since we're inside of the property binding of control group as form, we can just assume that when we provide the control of full name, it's the same thing as saying forms.controls.fullname. So that's just one level of groups, but we also can nest groups, because sometimes in our form we need to break them up and separate the concerns of our form and maybe only validate certain pieces of it at a time. So a really good example of this is an address. So an address usually has multiple pieces: the street, the city, the state, and the zip. And a lot of times you just want to know, is the address actually valid? And we don't have to evaluate that the entire control is valid. And this is a lot easier than having to say, if this is valid, but this is not, if this is valid and this is not valid. I don't have to do that. All I have to do is say group.controls.address.valid. And depending on what the user's input at the time, it'll return back whether it's valid. And the way that we provide nested groups is we have a control group decorator, just how we have the control decorator. And so we know that we're form.controls.address, so all we have to do is provide address. And then since we're within address, we know we just have to provide street, city, state, zip, all the things that we expect to be nested underneath our form. So when it comes to dealing with changes over time, we use observables in Angular 2. And observables are well, how many people here are actually familiar with observables? So like raise your hand if you've used it. Now, how many people have used observables? So it's not totally like a new concept to people, but how many people here are familiar with promises? So when you first used Angular 1, you may have not been familiar with promises, but then very quickly you became familiar with them and saw that it was a great way to deal with asynchronous data flow. Like, let me know something is loaded, then I'm going to execute this. Observables provide something similar, but rather than just telling whether something is loaded one time, observables happen over time. So that works really well with a stream of events. So I might be receiving a stream of events back from the server through Firebase or through WebSockets, or I might just want to know when events happen through a form over time. So right here in Angular, we have first-class support for observables. We're currently using the RX library as the implementation, but observables are coming in ES7, and we use all the parts of the ES7 spec from RxJS, so we hope to one day use just native observables. So what we're doing right here is we're just creating a blank control, and we're creating a reference out to Firebase, which is a pretty rad way for you to save your data to the cloud in real time. And so I have my backend right here, and then now I say control.valuechanges.subscribe. And what the subscribe function allows me to do is I give it a function. And that function will be called every single time the value is updated from this control. And it gives me the new value. So what I do with it is with Firebase, I call ref.set, and I update the value to Firebase. So every single time something happens to the control, whether I typed into the text box, whether it's updated because of another dependent update, I will be able to fire this off and evaluate the change as they happen over time. So that's essentially all the talk on Angular 2 forms. It's time to actually show some code. So let's make sure my server is running, which is good. And now let's write some code. So let me make this kind of big. OK, so can you read this? Is this good? How about that? Is that good? Okay, all right, cool. So I'm going to cheat a bit, and ooh, that is way too big. Let's see. All right, we'll do here. So I have a couple snippets, so I'm totally cheating here. So we're going to import both all my usual suspects from Angular, and we're going to import all the usual suspects from Angular 2 forms. And so the first thing we do when we start an Angular app is we create a component. So I have another little snippet for that. And so this gives me my two annotations, component and view. It gives me my component controller. So I'm going to give a app selector. So I'll have the HTML selector of app. And now I'm going to name my class app component. So essentially right here, this is a valid Angular 2 component. And I want to hook it up so the page knows to render it. So I'm going to export a function, a main function, and I'm going to call the bootstrap method, which is provided by Angular. We imported it right up here. And I'm just going to pass in my app component, which is the name of my component controller. So at this point, if I go into my template, and I'll just give a little H1. This is an inline template. You can use a URL as well. This just condenses the code example for tonight. Say hello. Save. And I am building straight from Angular source, so that takes a little bit. So I'm going to go back and just talk about, again, what we're doing. We've imported everything from Angular, created our two annotations, and created our component controller, and then we've called bootstrap to make sure that the page can pick it up. So we finished. So let me do a refresh. It's loading. And hello. So we now, you all have written your first Angular 2 component, so feel very good about yourselves. So this just says hello. We want to actually create a form. So we're injecting the form builder with a parameter of b. So we're going to call this .form, and we'll say b.group. And we'll give it that object literal, and we'll give it a really simple control. We'll give it the name control, just call it name. We won't give it an initial value, and we'll make sure that it's required. So now we have a form with one control. So we know that when we start a form, we need to give it a control group property binding. And we want to set it to the property of our form, which is conveniently called form. It doesn't have anything to do with the actual form tag. I could call it my form. I could call it blah. It's just the name of my property. And now I want to use the control decorator. So I'll create a text box, use the control decorator, and then I just provide name. And to prove that it's binding, we'll do a little curly brace, form.controls.name.value. So now I'll build. We'll go over what we did. All we did is we used the form builder, which was given to us through dependency injection. We called the group method that allows us to create our form, and we created our one name control. We added the property binding for control group and added the control decorator to put the control on the page. And this is just binding the value as the user updates it. So now as we built, we'll refresh. And so I'm going to type in my name, and there it shows up right there. So that's pretty simple, but not particularly useful. So one of the things I did is I included Bootstrap right here in the HTML. So I know of these really cool CSS classes that come with Twitter Bootstrap that if your component is valid or your text box is valid, it'll give it a cool little green glow. But if it's not valid, it'll give it a little red glow to show the error state. So we're going to bind these. So they initially have a class of form group. And so all the classes I'm going to be adding are from Twitter Bootstraps. Angular doesn't have anything like that. And then I'm going to give this one a class of form control. So like I said, it's all Bootstrap. What I'm going to do that's Angular based is I'm going to bind to the CSS class property. And I can do something really cool. I actually can bind to just one class. So in this case, with the class for Twitter Bootstrap, it's called hasSuccess. So I can bind, give it an expression, and if my expression comes out to true, it will have the hasSuccess class. So in this case, I can call form.controls.name.valid. So if it's valid, it will have the success class. And I can do something very similar with the error class. Instead of hasSuccess, it's hasError, and I can negate my previous statements. So now we'll go and build. And just all we did right here is we just bound the control's state to CSS classes using property bindings in Angular, because class is an actual property onto this div. So we built, we'll refresh. And so now we see it has a red. Can you see the red? Is that red to everyone? All right, so this is red. If you don't trust me, it is. So it's invalid. I'll type my name, and now it's green. So just like that, I've just bound very simply to this form. So now, just to get into scope, I'm going to type a debugger statement, because we're going to do some magic inside of the browser. And we're going to show how observables work in Angular 2, and we'll actually even write a little test case inside the browser using console.assert. So I'm going to wait for Angular 2 to finish building. And I'm using that just because I want the latest and the greatest of all the good stuff in Angular 2. So now we've hit the debugger. So I'm going to break into the console, and let's write a little unit test. So I'm going to say var app is a new app component. So that's the component we just created. And if I do that, it's going to break because it requires a form builder. So I'm going to create a new form builder. And at this point, I know I have my app's form, and I can check to see if it's valid. And the initial state is not. So I could say console.assert app form.valid. Let's make sure it's false. And with console assert, it will just keep running along if the assertion is true. But if the assertion is not true, it will break. So assertion failed. So just through little simple methods, I can do unit testing on this. So when we took, so we'll do a refresh just to clear out everything and do everything from scratch. So we're inside the constructor of our app component. We can see that in the Chrome DevTools. So now, if I hit this in the browser, or in the console, we have the app component, which has a form. So I can say this.form.controls. Let's get the name control. Let's go to the value changes property, and let's get to our subscribe function to tap into observables. So I'm going to give it a function that returns the value. And in this case, I'm going to create a reference out to Firebase. And then right here, I have a Firebase. And this is my URL. So I'm just going to copy that over. And I'm going to put this right in here. And I'm just going to call it /value is where it's going to save. Oops, I did not want to do that. Let's see here. And then now I'll call ref.set. So every time the value changes, we're going to intercept the subscription. And we're going to actually save every change out to Firebase. So we're going to run through our form now. And I'm going to say hello. And then there it is in Firebase. So every time I update something, I can just easily put it into Firebase because I've already just intercepted the subscription. So that works pretty easy. So Angular 2 Forms allows us to handle complex logic. You saw how we use controls and control groups to set up our structure for dependent controls. And then we're able to use validators to take all the complex things that determine whether a control is valid. We can put that into one little function. And then also, since our controls and control groups are isolated from the DOM, we can easily write them in unit tests. And then we saw how observables allow us to simplify watching the changes of our controls as they happen over time. So that's Angular 2 Forms in a nutshell. There's a lot more to it that's being built right now, but this is the working bits we'd like to show you. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. One of the guys who spent the bulk of the work, Victor Savkin, is here. He will answer all the really hard questions you have. So thank you so much.
All right. We also have the Angular team here in force, and you can ask us anything, but let's ask David about forms first, maybe. Who has some questions? Yeah, back here.
Hi. So I saw the validators. Can we have these validators chain, like custom validators one after the other for a specific field? and have them validate only if the first one goes through. We might, so basically if this required doesn't meet, I wouldn't want to go do the validation of the second one, and I don't want to explicitly take care of the logic of having to check if it's required is met in my second directive.
So essentially you're asking, like, can I use multiple validators on one control, and can I like make sure if one is an answer, if one is false, just like stop immediately? So you want like granular control over that. Well, right now, the reason why we return an object through the validators is so you can actually compose them together. Because when it's an object, it's not just true or false, which isn't useful in conjunction. So essentially, you would have to create your own like composed validator. So you could take two validators and add them together, so it returns all that, and then you supply that one validator there, and so that would work. There right now, the required one. You correct me if I'm wrong. I believe that we just run everything, but there is like we're working on it, so like you can short circuit your like your logic, or say just stop right now. Is that right there?
Yeah, I think you're correct. So basically, we decided to pass an individual validator as an array because we don't want to provide one blessed competition function for you. So you can decide how you want to compose them. Rather you run everything, or you run them selectively. For example, you stop on the first failure or whatever. So it's very easy to write, and we provide one, but most likely we'll provide like a few most common ones.
I want to ask about async validators, how those work. Can you return a promise in validator or not?
You just pass it right next to him.
Sure. So currently they do not work, but internally we already have a state to track the asynchrony. So if you have a validator that returns a promise or an observable, it will be treated as an async validator. You can. So if you return a promise or an observable, it's an async validator.
Victor, why don't you come stand up here with that mic, and I'm going to pass this over here.
So kind of following along with that, I guess, general theme, if I had a forms section, could I have an observable that is watching for like going offline, so all those fields would go offline in essence? So I'd know that if I've lost my connection or something like that, it's controlling it for all those fields, or would I have to put it right now in each of those fields and watch for that?
And by offline, what do you mean by going offline?
So if I'm on a mobile device, I do a lot of mobile stuff. So if I'm on a mobile device, I lose my connection to my database. I can't get my Firebase or whatever I'm running on the back end. But I've got somebody who's doing a form thing. I don't want them to keep entering data if they can't get that data. And I want to invalidate all those form fields until they can get to something or hold that data.
I'm not sure about the details. Maybe we can chat in person after the presentation. Like you can listen to a group of fields on a forum, same way you can listen to an individual field. So you can do that, but we don't have any special handling of like going offline or online currently, and probably won't have in forums themselves. So you should be able to integrate with like some other facility that you have, but I don't think forums will do that.
Yeah, you want to set this form as disabled when you're offline. I think that we would rely on a different mechanism for that. Yeah. Other questions? Right there, and then in front. Okay, good.
Yeah, you said that work is in progress for Angular 2 forms. So when it's ready to use for us?
Sorry, say it again.
Yeah, you said in the beginning in the presentation that work in progress for Angular 2 form. So is it out for use for the applications which we develop?
Oh, well, everything Angular 2 is a work in progress, so this falls underneath that. But the general everything is a work in progress. Everything is still alpha. Got the big alpha stamp on it. So
okay.
Everything I showed you tonight, you can totally use, but it's not something that I would use for fun to get going on it, to do cool things. But I would not say like my next big app is all going to be Angular 2 right now.
Okay, thanks.
And the reason we do this is so you guys can give us input on how it's going, so that when we can get to a good state.
Hi. Without having reference to the object literal, for example, and if you already built like a control group of some sort, right? And you only have a reference to the control group, can you still like recompose that or add more fields to that control group?
Okay, so basically we have I actually have 3 core primitives for building forms. So like the atoms, the smallest one, controls. Then you have control groups, which is basically like records of controls. And we also have control arrays that allow you to have like a variable length set of controls. So you can enable and disable certain controls and remove certain controls from a control group after you construct it. Yeah, so a control array when you have basically a collection of controls of the same shape, that you want to deal with, whereas the control group is a collection of controls of different shapes, so you have like name and age, like string and a number, yes, where the control array would be like all of them are strings.
You showed example for application written in TypeScript, but how would it look like in ES5? How dependency injection would look like? How wouldn't be it ugly and disgusting to write? I'm just curious.
Yeah, everything you saw that I wrote in ES5 is pretty simple, and like it all follows a format like dot annotations for for the annotations, and it's very similar for dependency injection and everything like that. There is a specific formula that everything actually goes down to from TypeScript, from ES, or from however you're like writing TypeScript. That's what happens underneath the scenes.
Yeah, because just when you transpile TypeScript to JavaScript, it looks not that pleasant.
No, TypeScript is idiomatic JavaScript. TypeScript is not, that's like CoffeeScript or Tracer, where you see it and it kind of looks like you're not sure what happened, but TypeScript, today, go use TypeScript and write a class, and it comes out to a module pattern. It's idiomatic, clean JavaScript. Most of the stuff that TypeScript spits out is like better than the stuff I'd write.
Okay, thanks.
So just to make a point, in Angular 1, we had this kind of crazy syntax for doing dependency injection. There's that crazy syntax in Angular 2 also for ES5, so feel free to continue using it if you like ES5. What David was showing you is, if you like to use the TypeScript annotations, maybe this is a little cleaner for your apps. So you're not forced to do it. Over here. And then there.
How do you get to the underlying form data object? I assume there's like a POJO somewhere that you can access outside of the scope of a single control or a group of controls. How is that exposed?
For a form, for a control .value, for a control group .value. So that'll actually return the whole thing.
So it'll actually be a JavaScript object that resembles the structure of the controls.
Yeah, I can check to see if something is valid, and then like on a submission, I can like on submit, then call .value and send that out to my server, and it's just all one POJO.
So you talked a little bit about annotations, and I know that with the change to TypeScript, the official thing is decorators now, and you seem to be kind of using them interchangeably, and I'm just curious on what's the sort of roadmap on going to TypeScript, and do they become decorators, and are annotations sort of your own special decorators? And could you just clarify a little bit between decorators, annotations, and...
Well, from what, yeah, he's definitely better at answering that. But when I was talking about decorators, there's a concept within Angular 2 called decorators, which is like essentially another, like how we create components, we can create decorators. So it's an overloaded term, but it was something else.
I'm definitely curious on the YCats decorators versus AT-scripts annotations, if you like.
So there's the decorator, not standard, what do you call it? It's a proposal. By Yehuda, and we're working with him. We're also working with TypeScript people, and we're trying to make sure that all of those align. Conceptually, annotations are slightly different than decorators, but you can express an annotation in form of a decorator. The thing that we're trying to make sure that happens is that the annotations and decorators are composable, which is what we're trying to work out right now, but that's going to happen as well. So what you should be looking forward to is that there's going to be but one system. There's not going to be different things of doing it.
And we'll go right here next. Oh, ask your question. Great, good. I don't have to snub these guys then. Cool. Go back here and then up there.
Yeah, what do I use if I want to do something like a wizard or like a step panel which like steps the user through multiple things. Like in each one of the step has forms. So do I still continue and use control group for each individual form, or is there
Right.
something more?
So I guess the question is, what could you use for something like a wizard? Each pane in the wizard would be an independent form, independent group that you could just step through. I think that is something that you, as an application developer, it's a concept that makes sense for the application itself. So the application itself can create that concept.
Yeah. So, what would the interface look like when, like, to handle invalidating, like a control based on a response, like after submitting the form?
So you're saying you submitted a form, you got back like you got a response from the backend, and it's invalid, and the validation passed. That's what you're saying, yes?
Right. So, like, there was additional validation on the server side that was handled in the response.
Okay. So first of all, like we will support async validation. So in theory, you should be able to submit an async validation before you like submit the form finally, yes? And because you can assign a validation to a group, you can actually have a form scoped validations that will verify that the whole thing is like correct, yes? But let's say you submitted a form because you don't have the right validation. And if you receive a response, you can set a list of errors on the control. Because basically, a control is a way for us to interact with the form both ways. It's like two-way data bindings, but in a very scoped form, you know? That's why you can set a value on the control and to update the DOM. Yes? Somebody updates the DOM, you will receive the updated value. And same goes for errors and everything else. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. And we'll go right here.
Will there, excuse me, will there be some kind of equivalent of ng messages for the like user feedback?
Yes, most likely it's going to. It is not okay. Yes, something like that would be definitely built on top of it. Keep in mind, what we're presenting today is the absolute core primitives, and there's going to be layers that are going to be built on top of these things, whether it's going to be, as I said, data-driven forms or template-driven forms or these messages. These are all going to be layers that are going to be sitting on top of it, but understanding the core concepts is kind of the key of how we're going to deal with forms.
And Ben.
Hey, I was wondering how deep the observable support goes. Can I get an observable of form submissions or an observable of form validations?
All right, so currently we have only one observable. Like every control has an observable, including groups and arrays and whatnot. Like validations will require separate observable when async validations will be in. Because currently, because only sync validations are in, it will sort of match, you know, like your value observable and your validations observable. When async validations are in, we'll have another observable for validations because it won't match anymore. And for form submissions, like we don't have any plans right now, so I don't know. We need to evaluate all the options there.
I have a question is for form group and with the form. So how form group and to manage the form inside of form group? For example, if I can get all the data inside of form group, so will you provide some function, you know, help to manage the inside form in the form group? And another thing is how the form for example, inside the form group, maybe we'll have multiple form. So how them to communication with each other?
I think what was not shown over here is where we've talked about a form, and if you think what a form is, it's kind of the underlying data plus things like validation and the relationships between each other. One thing that we have not presented is how you take the data out of the form and place it into a POJO. And then once you place it in a POJO, you can move it around and load it to other forms and so on. But that's something that's going to come in later.
Okay, thank you.
A question over there and then here. Okay. Get some exercise. Okay. No, oh, wait. We're on live stream. Please ask on the microphone. Thanks.
So there are web components and there are Angular components. What's the relationship between the two?
Okay, good question. So web components have certain properties that make them. For example, you cannot do dependency injection with them because of the life cycle. Um, they're a lot more imperative in their style. And Angular components are, we have dependency injection, we have life cycle, we can do reuse of the views and a couple other tricks. And so as a result, they're not identical. But what we wanted to work really hard on is to make sure that Angular can consume web components out of the box. And also, if you were to do a little extra work, you could take an Angular component and wrap it in a web component. So the way to think about it is the Angular component is kind of the lightweight version of the web component, which is what you need most of the times.
I forget who is next. I'm sorry.
You go for a while.
Are you guys going to be supporting kind of forms within forms or having componentized forms? So if you do something all the time, you can sort of pick it up and just drop it in wherever, and it could be a part of another form, for example.
Yes. So having you can group things from a visual point of view. You can group things in components and then just reuse those components.
More questions? Yeah.
Can you show your example just real quick? The one that you just wrote. I just have one question regarding that. So, can we see the template? Sorry. Yes, exactly. So I was wondering, in a curly braces, so that's two-way data binding, or because I'm just, so I mean you're binding to the value, right? So whatever you, oh, so there is a control name, so you put, so that's how you put the value in, and then the curly braces, is it like a two-way data binding, or is it like?
So that curly braces is a one-way, meaning that when the value, when the forms that controls that name, that value changes, we will update the UI. It cannot be two-way because, well, there's nothing like, there's no way to user to interact. This is just the text, right?
Yeah, I'm just saying that. So it just pulls data, but effectively this works like two-way data binding, because like whatever you put in input goes to underlying model, right? And then it comes back on the curly
Yes,
braces.
so as you type, it will automatically update.
Yeah, that's what we saw. But I mean, I'm just trying to kind of, because I heard that like the two-way data binding is kind of dead, right? So I'm trying.
So that's not what two-way data binding is. This is one-way, meaning, so in order for you to have two-way, there's got to be two actors that could potentially change the value, right? Here, there's only one actor, which is the expression itself. Only the expression is changing, and as a result, we update the UI. So this is called one-way data binding, and this is not going away. This is always going to be here, and nobody's suggesting that one-way data binding is going away.
Sure. All right. Cool. Thanks.
Okay. One or two more questions, maybe, or none more questions. That's also fine. Yeah. Okay. Great. Oh, back here. Yes. Great. Make that the last one.
So yeah, looking at this template, I'm just wondering. So, the plural form of control, is that just? It seems like magic to me that from one control equal name, I have a property called controls. So
when you instantiated a form group, is that control group? Sorry, control groups. It has a property called controls, which is a list of all of the child controls inside of it.
Okay, so that's the property of
yes,
form control. Okay.
Okay, awesome. Everyone, thanks so much. We'll look forward to more of your feedback. Please keep it coming. You can give it on GitHub or Twitter or Google+, and we'll see you at the next meetup. Thanks, everybody. Bye.